Power of Babble, the podcast where nothing's off the table. From Bible mysteries and strange phenomena to the questions that keep you up at night, we explore it all with curiosity and faith. I'm your host, Courtney, joined by my co-hosts, Caleb and Jeremy. Together, we dive into the weird, the wonderful, and the wildly curious. So grab your coffee, open your mind, and let's babble. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Power of Babble. We're so excited that you joined us again. Just a disclosure, the toesies are out today.
You're just
And you're
to
just going to have to get used to it.
I did not expect you to actually say that.
You know, it is what it is.
You have to stop.
Listen, so if you're not aware, if you
I
haven't,
hope we get flagged on YouTube. That's what
if you haven't,
We're going to get demonetized.
yeah,
before we even get monetized.
No, I mean, obviously we're filming 2 episodes at least when we get together. So, I mean, we're in the same
So
clothes.
you
as
can't
one.
say that. You're ruining the
It is what it is.
magic.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, y'all didn't give me credit for the last one that we did. Minimal movement out of myself.
Mhm.
I didn't put my legs up at all. I kept my shoes on.
Open toed shoes, but yes.
Open-toed shoes. I mean, it's freaking summertime. It's hot. I just can't do it this time. I just had to get comfortable.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm bringing a different kind of energy to this.
You certainly are.
Just by me sitting the way I want to sit. And
I
so
can't argue with that.
You certainly are.
the toesies are out and you're going to have to deal with it. Okay. Sorry, I've derailed us already. I tend to do that.
It's all good.
What I was going to ask you guys what books you've been reading lately. We'll do our little book segment of the show. We need to name our book segment.
We should. You should think about that later.
I will. I'll think on that.
I'm going to let Jeremy go first because I'm afraid I might go on a rant.
We know you will.
My answer is probably the least interesting. I continue my streak of reading slop. Actually, this is really good. This is high art in my opinion. Naoki Urasawa's 20th Century Boy. I finally finished all 12 massive volumes of it. He managed to land the plane. It was amazing. This is the conspiracy theory like manga about like the secret society who's a cult leader who tries to take over the world and a bunch of middle-aged
Interesting.
losers who have to try to stop him. Really good stuff.
All right. How long did it take you to read all that?
Weeks, if not months.
Okay. I
Months
think you
and months.
mentioned that you were reading it last time
Yeah.
when you did this
Yeah.
segment.
Yeah.
All the books are like 500 pages and there's like 12 of them.
Jeez.
Yeah.
And it's
That's cheap.
coherent. That's the crazy thing. It's a coherent, cohesive story, and it's that long. And you wrote and drew the whole thing. It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you've been enjoying that.
Is that all that you have? You've just been deep into this
I mean,
manga
I've been
series?
reading other stuff, but there's nothing that rises.
What do you have
to-
time for anything else? That many
Nothing
volumes?
compares. Yeah.
Yeah, I have been reading an eclectic bunch of craziness. So I've read the lines are blurred between, because I know you usually ask like if you're reading something for pleasure or
Yeah,
something that's a
yeah.
little bit more like heady or whatever. Lately it's really been the same. So it's like kind of both. I think I mentioned on a previous podcast I'd been reading Craig Keener's book Spirit Hermeneutics, which was a phenomenal book. I mean, I really enjoyed it. Very insightful. I found myself pretty much agreeing with the thrust of his arguments, which is usually the case with Keener. Not always. There's a few things we disagree on, but for the most part, he's one of those scholars that going into the books, it's like I'm fairly confident that this is going to be not only fruitful for me, but also probably something that matches my own theology. So highly recommend that book. The other one is more strange.
Okay.
So I've been talking about on other podcasts. I keep bringing up conspiracy theories. Which is interesting that the thing
Are you
you were
going
reading.
deep into the rabbit holes of conspiracy theories?
He's the rabbit.
Yeah, well, yeah. Here's
He's
the
not
thing.
in the rabbit holes. He's the whole rabbit.
I'm also maybe the one pulling back the curtain on Oz, because. Yeah, so I'm fascinated.
right now.
Yeah, I'm fascinated not really by the conspiracies. That's what's interesting about like the conspiracies to me very rarely have anything
You're just debunking them.
interesting. not even that. I'm fascinated about the frenzy that people get caught up in with this, and how the popularity of conspiratorial thinking has become so mainstream. It used to be
Yes.
fringe, right?
Yeah.
I mean, used to that it would be like the conspiracy theorists are
You're like,
over there, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's so mainstream, and there are lots of good sociological reasons for why that's the case. But it has caused me to sort of start reading more about this the major conspiracy theories and things like that. So, what I'm reading right now, what I've been reading, is a book called Reclaiming History. It's by Vincent Bugliosi, who if you know Bugliosi, you know that he is the one who was the prosecutor in the Manson murders.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He was the LA County prosecutor who got very famous for that case for obvious reasons. It's a very famous case. And then he wrote a book about it years later called Helter Skelter, where he sort of just recounts his experience with that whole phenomena, which became a worldwide news at the time. He later, the short version of this is that in the 1980s, he was approached by, I think it was a television company in England, who wanted to do a mock trial prosecuting Lee Harvey Oswald, who was the man accused of killing John F. Kennedy. And so they wanted a real judge, real attorneys, real prosecutor, real defense, and they wanted to assemble all the original real life eyewitnesses to the crime and do the trial as close as possible to what it would have been had Jack Ruby not killed Lee Harvey Oswald before he was able to go to trial. And so they did this. I watched it out of curiosity. It's a multi-part series. It's very, very interesting. This caused Bugliosi to go down the rabbit hole of this whole topic, having prosecuted successfully, by the way. He convicted Oswald in the mock trial. To go down the rabbit hole of investigating all the events surrounding Kennedy's assassination. And he wrote a 1,600-page book on the topic with copious footnotes and documentation from primary sources that took him over 20 years to write. And in the book, it is a comprehensive history of the events, and then after that it is also his prosecutorial style where he examines the conspiracy theories and argues against them.
And that's the book you've been reading?
That's the book I've been reading. It's 1,600 pages. I'm about 500 pages into it right now, so I have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But up until this point, I'll say this. He does it. There's a section in the book early on where it's like I think it's called like 4 days that change history or something like that, where he covers the 4 days surrounding the assassination. The book is worth the price of admission for this alone because he goes hour by hour and uses all primary source material to recount the history of what happened. So even just for that, it's worth checking out the book. But it is a very interesting thing. So I'm going to read that book. I've read other conspiracy books on the Kennedy assassinations in the past, so I'm pretty familiar with the topic. But I may go from there and then read about the 9/11 stuff. I just want to familiarize myself with the pattern of thinking that people have so that I can understand the topic better. I know that maybe that's really nerdy, but...
No, I think it's very fitting for just what you do.
Yeah.
I mean, you do a lot of teaching, biblical teaching and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that's
pursuing truth and facts.
And there's a lot of people around our circles that
you know who you are,
that dive into the conspiracies. So I think that's a good avenue for you to be doing.
Yeah.
So props to you.
What are you reading, Court?
That's a good question. I think maybe last time we had talked on here, I was kind of in a reading lull. I think I had said. I don't know, for various reasons, but I'm getting momentum again, and I'm really excited about it. So one of them, like they're both like, I guess, fun ones. I have 3. I like to read. Do y'all do this?
Read multiple titles?
I do read,
so many titles at once. Yes?
I do read.
He reads, he said.
But like, do you simultaneously read books, or are you like committed to one?
So if I do, I have done it in the past. I'm not currently doing that because of 2 reasons. One, if the book I'm reading is good enough, I don't want to read anything else.
Yes.
That's a big motivating factor. The
Yeah,
the
I agree
other
with that.
one is this: if I'm going to read multiple titles, it has to be a sweet and salty kind of thing.
Yeah.
They can't be similar. They have
Yeah.
to be very different.
Okay, I agree with all of that.
Yeah.
Because like I've been in a very like mystery psychological thriller vibe right now, and so I've like pumped out like 3 or 4 of those types of books where like in a day I'll finish one if
Yeah.
it's like a really good one or whatever. I do need hold on, let me grab this one because I forget the name of it. So I've been reading this. This is my like I guess spiritual or learning book. I don't know. It's called Practicing the Way. Be with Jesus, become like him, do as he did. It's by John Mark Comer.
Okay.
Comer. I don't know.
Yeah.
Really good. It's very light. It's not like, but it's got good nuggets that I'm gleaning from.
Good. Yeah.
So I like that one a lot. My other one for pleasure is a book called The Maidens. One of my favorite psychological thrillers, I may have mentioned it on here before. It's called The Silent Patient. They're teasing that they're going to come out with a movie that I would love to happen. But it's by Alex Michaelides, I think is his name. Absolute, like one of my favorite books ever. You have to check it out. It's really good. Kind of like mystery thriller. So The Maidens is one of his books that I read, and it was okay. But why I'm mentioning it is because it really like it had a lot of like Greek mythology throughout it, which I didn't understand because newsflash, I'm just not typically haven't been into that kind of stuff.
She's checked out.
So it made me like maybe I feel like I would have appreciated the book more if I would have kind of understood that more. So saying that, I know I've been talking about was reading the Iliad. I finished the Iliad.
Oh, congratulations.
Nice.
Yes, I finished it. And really like once I full disclosure, I had to audiobook it.
Okay.
Because I just I was really struggling to get into it. So many, again, didn't understand Greek mythology and all of that. So like just a lot that I didn't understand. So, but it gave me more appreciation for the maidens. And it kind of just got me thinking, just because a lot of that book kind of like made me think about Genesis 6.
Okay.
And because, and I think I mentioned this too, like I was very intrigued by the way that the gods really like pushed in on humanity and messed with humanity, messed with free will and all of that. And just thinking about, what happened with the Nephilim in Genesis 6. And I want to make sure, because I wrote down, I was like, I need to ask the guys this. But to me, it was almost like, no wonder God intervened in that moment and sent a flood, because what happens when other creatures and beings interfere with humanity, you get what happened in the Iliad and all of this. So I guess my question is, and maybe this will be our whole episode, I don't know, do you think, does God break in to humanity still and cause things to happen? And I ask, I guess adjacent question is, like, for example, all the fires that were happening in California. I heard people saying like, oh, well, that's just God bringing judgment, or, all of this stuff. Do we still see God doing stuff like he did back in the Old Testament, as far as like not messing with free will, but kind of exerting himself in situations like that? Is that biblically sound to believe something like that? I don't really know how to pose the question,
No,
but
it's
do you
a
pick up
very-
what I'm saying?
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a
yeah.
very
It's-
interesting
it's-
question.
This is, yeah.
I
this
don't
is
know
really
how we
interesting.
want to.
Yeah.
Let's start with like the California stuff, because I feel like that was super, and you could probably make an argument that there's beliefs and questions like that about anything that's happening mainstream right now. But is there any like backing to claims like that God is interjecting and causing like natural disasters to happen in our world?
Yeah. So okay. So let me say a couple preliminary comments on just the concept about divine interference, or interference may not be the right word. divine intervention of some
Yeah.
sort, right?
But even intervention, I think, is kind of loaded.
Yeah, it is. I was grasping for a
Yeah.
word that doesn't carry a connotation, because sometimes when talking about the issue of the miraculous, sometimes historically philosophers have used terms like breaking the laws of physics and things, which is also similarly loaded in terms of like, well, it's giving a connotation as though there's a violation of some sort,
Right.
right? Well, I don't. The reason why we were trying to avoid that kind of language is because the idea of God, and we're setting aside the mythological, like Greco-Roman gods. We're just talking about the one true God. The idea of the Creator God acting within His creation, to me, there is no connotation of interference or meddling or breaking of laws. None of those things sort of apply, because what we're talking about is an artist who has painted on a canvas and who has decided to touch something up or to do something to the thing that he has created, right? And so there's no negative connotation to that. So I guess to answer that part of the question would be to say, can and does God act within the thing that He has created?
Yes.
I would say yes, He does.
Yeah.
We are not deists, right? Deism is the claim that God creates the cosmos and then hands off.
Right.
Right? He sort of pushes the domino, and now there's this chain reaction of things, and He just observes from then on. This is not the claim of Christianity, right? The Judeo-Christian God is the God who is active in His creation, not just in terms of doing things that we would view as spectacle, which He sometimes does, but actually the claim of Christianity is that God is active in upholding creation in its existence. Right? So, in other words, if he ceased being active on the created order, nothing would occur, right? Because he's the source of its vitality.
Yeah.
So that would answer the one question about can and will. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think maybe a term for it is like supernatural acts within the natural order, if we want to deal with the limit cases.
Sure.
But like you just said, the fact that there is a natural order is only because He is acting, all the time.
Yeah, we're kind of limited on language, because even the term supernatural sort of.
Well, I use supernatural in its strictest sense,
Yeah.
in the sense of like non-material.
Yes.
Right, like non-material, and of course that has material effects, which is why we, can point to it and notice it with our eyes or whatever. But yeah, I would agree with what Caleb said there. And maybe this is the direction you were gonna go next, but I would also separate the idea of God acting and God judging as two different questions, two related, definitely, but different questions.
Well, and that's, I guess, what I'm getting at, because I don't think anybody would, well, I'm sure somebody would, but I mean, we have to believe that He acts within humanity, or why do we pray?
Right.
Why? So I think it's more of not the positives of God interacting with us, but more of the negatives,
The
like
negatives.
the judgment.
Yeah.
So I have lots of thoughts on this, so you guys just interrupt me if I ramble on too long.
Gladly.
What you will find, I think, and I'm not making a hard and fast claim here that this is universal, but I would say it's a common thread in Scripture, is that very often God's acts of judgment are actually less active and more passive. And when I say passive, I don't mean he's not doing anything, but I mean, well, here's what I mean. Oftentimes when God judges a particular people or a particular group or something like that, often the way in which He does this is by turning them over to their own desires.
Like in Romans 1.
Right, and Romans 1 is a great example of this, right? So God, in other words, the thing that they are pursuing, that God is displeased with, is actually the thing that will be the source of their own destruction. And so what God will often do in judgment, and what Scripture terms as judgment, is that He lets them have it, right? And so this is a recurring thing that happens Old Testament and New Testament, where God turns them over to their own desires. There's actually a really good book by G.K. Beale, and I think it's called you are what, or we are, I can't remember the exact title, you are or we are what we worship.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And he explored, he's a first-rate scholar, a tremendous scholar, and his specialty is the New Testament use of the Old. And he explores idolatry and the ways in which idolatry, the way in which the idolaters become the very thing that they are being tempted by, right? And this is, I think, very much in line with this idea of God turning us over to our own desires, right? And so I just say that to say that judgment is often not what we think of it, what we would assume judgment
Yes.
might be, right? Sometimes I think we get this idea that God, that Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is like Zeus on Mount Olympus, who is hurling lightning bolts at those who he's angry with.
Yeah.
And that's actually not the portrait that Scripture paints. What the portrait of God in his judgment is a God who desires righteousness. That is to say, he desires humanity to be in alignment with his own nature and goodness. And when they do not, he sort of turns them over to their desires, because their desire, the reason why he is trying to prevent them from engaging in some activity is because that very activity is not good for them.
Right.
Right? It's not the thing that is meant to make them flourish. What will make humanity flourish? Well, by doing the things that are in alignment with God's character and his goodness. And so I think that that kind of judgment, wherein God allows us to sort of make a mess of ourselves, God is very much still doing that to this day.
Yeah.
Now, maybe the rejoinder to that is that when people say this, they're not talking about that kind of judgment. Maybe they're talking about something that's a little flashier, or maybe a little bit more overt.
I think, yes, I think most of the time when they talk about God's judgment in these contexts, it is something flashier, like a meteor falling out of the sky and,
Yeah, wiping people out.
obliterating someone's house, or, especially in the example you gave, Courtney, with the fires, right? You could make the case that it definitely was the judgment in turning people over to the consequences of their actions because of government ineptitude and et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to get
not taking care of God's creation.
I don't want to get political,
Yeah.
whatever, but you can make that case that was a form of judgment, and connecting the dots between different things and saying, well, why doesn't this commonly happen in other places? It was because of the choices that had been made.
Consequences, yeah.
But I think, Courtney, what I heard in your example was, no, God made the spark intentionally.
Yeah.
And it was like, all right, the
Over
winds are gonna
LA.
blow. Yeah,
Yeah.
the winds are gonna blow here and burn down these people's houses
Yeah.
because I don't like these people, or these people are like so awful that we have to get rid of their houses or whatever. And I think that, like Caleb seems to be implying, I think that's dicier. That's dicier in most cases.
And I think that we may have some biblical justification for saying that that's dicey.
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
absolutely.
And here's the example that comes to my mind, which is, and verify all the quotations I say, because this is all off the cuff. Courtney didn't share her question before we started.
Supplies.
But in the Gospels, there is an episode in the Gospels where people, well, there's a couple that come to mind actually.
Yes.
One of which is where there's a tower in Siloam that falls and kills some people.
Yes.
And they bring this before Jesus, and they say, this was God's judgment.
Yeah.
And Jesus basically just says, no.
Yeah.
It's not.
He says, do you think that the 70 people that were killed from the tower falling, do you think they were any worse than the rest of the people?
Yeah, exactly. And what he does is he redirects them to think about their own sinfulness and their own deserving of God's judgment. And what the point I think that Jesus is trying to make by just eliminating their speculation on this happening is to say, you shouldn't be so presumptive as to think that that you know the will of God and what he's up to. That's probably outside your purview since you're not omniscient. But B, the implied superiority that we have when we pronounce such judgments on other people without looking inward, right? Right, to say, oh, this happened to these people who are not me, because clearly God must have wanted to judge them. Meanwhile, when some misfortune befalls us, we
Yeah.
surely wouldn't jump to the same conclusion,
Well,
right?
in that case, it's obviously an attack of the devil.
It's the
or
enemy, right?
Yeah.
Or it was
Yeah.
unlucky, something like that. And so I think Jesus sort of dispels this and says, look, you shouldn't presume this kind of knowledge, because what you should be doing, this like the take the 2x4 out of your own eye
Mhm.
before you
Yeah.
look for the speck in your neighbor's,
Yeah.
is because he's saying, look, you don't worry about what God's disposition is to this other group of people, when what you should be worried about is what is his disposition toward me.
Yeah.
So that's the other the other one that comes to my mind is the one where they ask him, they say, Lord, this man has been blind from birth.
Mm-hmm.
Who is it that sinned? Is it on account of his own sin or his mother and father's sin?
Yeah.
And Jesus says neither. He says, in fact, the reason why he was born blind is so that the Son of Man may be glorified.
Yeah.
And then he heals him, right? But the idea here is that I think there's a lot to be learned from that, actually, right? Which is not just to say that God let this man be born blind so that Jesus could heal him. Yes, that's part of the story. But it also teaches us something about the providence of God, which is
Yes.
that we shouldn't presume to know the reasons why God permits certain things to happen, because God may have reasons that fall outside of what we consider to be the possibilities. Because
Yeah.
the people who bring this to Jesus, they have a set of possibilities in their
Yes.
mind. Well, clearly he's either sinned or his parents have sinned. And what Jesus shows them is, you think too small to know the mind of God in this respect.
We don't know the end from the beginning in many, many, many cases.
Yeah.
But God does.
Yeah, and so this tragedy, whether it be a corporate tragedy like in the case of the falling of the tower, or the tragedy of this man's circumstances, I think in both cases, Jesus shows us that we need more humility in terms of being able to discern. Now, that's not to say that God couldn't have caused a tower to fall, or that he couldn't have stricken someone with something. But what it does do, I think, is force us to say we should not make these kinds of pronouncements.
Right.
And so even if it's plausible or possible that something may be the case, I would caution believers that you really should. I can't think of any circumstance where you should make that kind of pronouncement.
Yeah. In the particular moments of judgment that we see throughout, miraculous, supernatural, whatever you want to call it, judgment that we see throughout the Old Testament, are closely tied in with salvation history, right? The preservation of Israel, the getting them from point A to point B, all of those sorts of things. Which is not to say that God can't do those kinds of things nowadays. He probably is in various ways.
Sure.
But I think that what you said there about presumption, I think is the heart of the matter. Because we, in our limited knowledge and limited understanding of God, are on very, very dicey territory to be pointing fingers and connecting dots to say, well, you did this, so this is your judgment for that. Like, there's no biblical precedent for thinking that we should be doing that.
Yeah, and there is a human nature element which is part of the sin nature, which is to say that we can see it so clearly in others and not see it in ourselves. Which is why the amazing, I just love when the prophet brings this story to David and says, "What do you think of this moral sets of circumstances?" And he says, "The man should be killed."
Yeah.
And he says, "Thou art the man."
Thou art the man.
Which is the greatest mic drop moments in Scripture.
Yeah, one of the gutsiest lines in
Need
the
to
Old
turn
Testament.
it on you, buddy,
Yeah.
but
and the realization breaks David, right?
Yeah.
When he realizes, and it's because he's able to step outside of himself for a moment and see the wickedness of his own actions because he thinks it's someone else, right? And I think we do this all the time, which is that I can look around me and see the sin and depravity of the world, and yet I can't see that I am the man in the same way. Yeah.
I want to talk through this because I'm just thinking about my own beliefs about this question, I guess. Because I feel like as believers, as humans, we often blame the enemy for things that happen to us, or we judge God for not intervening with certain things that happen to us. And I just feel that we don't put enough weight on ourselves, I guess, in the sense of I feel very strongly that every single this is where I want to kind of like get y'all's thoughts on my beliefs. Um, I feel like I guess strongly in the sense that like every single choice that I make holds weight. Whether I turn left or right out of my driveway is causing a ripple effect that could affect somebody.
Mm.
Um, so that's where I start to think about like um generational habits and things that are passed down um that that we might blame, oh well, like I'm an alcoholic and the enemy has targeted me and like put this
Right.
am I making sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that too much weight and extreme on our free will to believe so strongly that like the words that I'm saying right now could cause something generations to come?
So,
I don't
so
is
this
that a
is
weird question to ask?
no,
This
it's a
this is about no, it's not a weird question. It's a really important question, I think, and it has a lot to do with not only our personal agency and how we make decisions and whether those are free, but also cosmology.
Well, I'm even thinking about like the fires in
Yeah.
California. Like somebody's choice 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I truly believe affected whether
Yes.
those fires happened or not.
Yeah. So this
And
is
so I'm like, am I right in thinking that? I
yeah.
don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
this is kind of like so sometimes you hear it referred to as like the butterfly effect, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
Like
Or
what
chaos theory.
what you're describing is a much more rational and consequential version of that. But like the idea that like, oh, like I held in a sneeze, so therefore, um somebody ran over a squirrel or something crazy. It's like, and because I did that, I went through the traffic light a little faster, which caused this person to go a little slower, which did this, blah blah blah, blah, and then the squirrels run over.
Yeah.
And so it I but that is there are implications in there on how we view the world, and how we look at consequences, so actions and their consequences, and drawing them together in this massive matrix of decision making and also constraints, which I think is really interesting. I don't know, like Caleb, what do you think about that? Because I want to talk a little bit about grace in that context, but I don't want to. I feel like there's more to unpack before we get there.
Yeah, so there's a few things. So I'm gonna connect the Greco-Roman thing that you were talking about earlier to this
Okay.
because it is relevant, which is to say the different worldviews about divine quote unquote intervention, and providence and free will, because these are all very closely connected themes. And in what I have observed, and I think when you started reading the Iliad, I think you even texted me this pretty early on. You said you were sort of struck by how active the gods are in the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that observation is that what it shows us is the way that Greco-Roman people saw their own lives.
Yes.
Right, because they write because this is the interesting thing about the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is that the Iliad, at the very least, is what would be termed a mytho-historical narrative.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, there are some historical events that this is recounting, namely the Trojan War, or parts of the Trojan War. And yet, when they tell the story of the Trojan War, the way in which they do it is by illuminating to the reader the activity of the gods in the ordinary human events. Because in their worldview, there's no such thing as ordinary human events, right? They have a supernatural worldview, but their particular supernatural worldview, even though I would argue theirs is maybe not as fatalistic as others, lots of their views about the happenings in history are sort of caught up in the web that's being woven, which is another reference to the mythology, right? This idea that there actually is this weaving of this web of events.
The gods are pulling the strings.
The gods are pulling the strings.
Yeah, and you're right, and I think that's a really interesting connection. I've never thought about the Iliad and talking about like the gods inspiring, or in some cases it sounds almost like possession
Yes.
of them
Yeah.
doing stuff
Yes.
Well, they're
in the
manipulating
context of
their.
Genesis
I mean,
6.
Athena is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
showing up as other people,
Yes.
and
And it's
Deflecting an arrow here, changing,
Yeah,
things like
yeah.
that.
but yeah, you're right. There's a philosopher named Charles Taylor who in his book on secularism,
Yeah.
called A Secular Age, he really expounds the concept of what he calls the buffered self. And the buffered self is this largely modern concept that like there's us, there are hard and fast boundaries between us and the world and everything else. And he makes the case that like the ancients did not have this concept.
Yeah.
That at any moment you could be, supernatural forces especially could impinge upon you in ways that you could not control, you had no say over, and that would drastically affect your life.
So the reason why this is all important to the topic that we're talking about here is because I think it illustrates, and we're using the Greco-Roman thing as sort of a touch point, but I think this is true of sort of most, if not all, but I don't want to be too universalizing, but most other worldview systems, is that there's not as much room for what we would like to term free will in lots of these other ways of looking at the world.
Yes.
And I've talked about it before, but like, if you look at Norse mythology, for example, or like the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, those are the cultures associated with that. And when you look at their mythology, even their art, like look at Norse art, you see is it's actually these interlocking, weaving patterns. And what that is this is a serpent that is fate.
Yes.
It's actually the word, I've probably talked about this on other podcasts, but I know I've talked about it in some of the classes I've taught. But the word weird,
yes,
is an Anglo-Saxon word, right? And we use that word and we talk about something being strange, right? But that's
Sorry.
yeah, I am objectively weird. But in the original sense of the word, what it actually means is fate.
Yes.
Interesting.
And so the reason why there's been this change, that this is an interesting etymological lesson from history, which is that this old sort of archaic word meaning fate, talking about the weird, right? The fate of the gods. This is why in Anglo-Saxon and Viking mythology, Norse mythology, you have this idea of Ragnarok, right? It's this inevitable apocalyptic fate that we are hurtling towards, and nothing can stop it, right? And when Shakespeare wrote, and he wrote Macbeth, and you have the three witches, they're called, what are they called? They're called the weirding witches, right? And he uses this more archaic word for fate. And the reason why is because they prophesy to Macbeth something in the story, and the prophecy becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So they're called the weirding witches because weird is fate.
Yeah.
But because witches are weird in the sense that they're strange, the word morphed in its meaning over time. So people started using it to refer to strange. That's just a sidebar. But the reason I mention this is to say, if you look at all these world religions and you look at all of these cultures and you look at them, very often you will find this concept, especially in polytheistic worldviews, you will find this concept of the gods pulling the strings.
Yes. And
Christianity, the Judeo-Christian perception of who God is, which is a revelation of who God is a very different picture. And part of what, and we really need to do it with some point in an episode where we talk about the Imago Dei, the image of God, because I personally would argue, some scholars would disagree, but I would argue that one of the essential aspects of what it means to be made in the image of God, part of the equation, I'm not saying it's all of it, but part of the equation is the ability to will and to act as an agent. Free will, right? And the reason why is because this is something that God possesses. And when he creates us in his image, he gives us this ability as well. And so sort of baked in, sort of at the beginning of what the created order is in the Judeo-Christian worldview, is not one of a divine being who pulls the strings, but rather of a divine being who cooperates with other beings whom he has created, who also have free will, like he has.
Yeah.
But I think implicit in your description there I think people could of making these choices and them having long-term ramifications for people that may not even be born yet. I think that people could take that and could take, yes, we're made in the Imago Dei. We have that capacity for decision making and responsibility, and we are not bound by fate. And I think in our current time, the temptation is to take those realities and put this immense burden on ourselves.
Mm.
And to, there's this sort of hypervigilance, there's this anxiety. And Taylor talks about this as well, the guy that I just mentioned, who talks about, the buffered self. And, nowadays we think that we can't be impinged upon by outsiders. But this is still existentially problematic, right? Because maybe, we're not as worried about, being inhabited by Athena and doing crazy things. But we have this tendency, this temptation to set ourselves up as the gods of our own life, while also having to deal with the reality that we do not have the power to control our own lives.
Yeah.
And so
Well-
there's this toughness there. And that's why I said, like, I want to talk about grace, because I think that there is a sort of way in which that we ultimately have to direct our attention back to God and say, and there's this tension here. Yes, we are responsible for our choices, but we also have to trust that in the same way that God upholds the world and dispenses, his goodness throughout creation, that he will also, meet us where we are in our, limitations and flawed decision making, and dispense his goodness graciously in a way that we don't deserve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a um almost like a power that comes with free will.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the humbling part is that just kind of piggybacking on what you said is we aren't God. We don't have his providence. Um he knows what we're going to choose. He knows, the path that we're going to choose, which is like awe-inspiring to think about. But I guess both ways. People need to understand more that their actions hold weight. They're here for a reason. I think some people just go through life like, what does it even matter what I do?
Mhm.
Not even just day-to-day life, but just the grand scheme of things. We need, I guess, to be shaken a little bit to know that we're here for a purpose, and our choices do matter. But also have the humility to know that, we have grace when we mess up, and the weight of the world isn't on my shoulders because of my free will.
Well, this is one reason why. So I painted that portrait of the Judeo-Christian God being the God who has bestowed freedom to his creation, which is a huge piece of the puzzle, because I think it does make a very distinct worldview as opposed to competing points of view. But I don't want to mislead people into thinking that therefore the conclusion is, because it's not a fatalistic system like maybe the Greco-Roman or the Norse, or name your religion, like those are fatalistic in their approaches. Just because the Judeo-Christian portrait is not a fatalistic one does not mean that it's chaos.
Right.
And it does not mean, the other option would be the one that you sort of alluded to, which is that it also does not mean that I'm God, right? So, because, and I did this recently in a small group that I lead, where we talked about, and it's a good plug for, we did an episode where we talked about Calvinism and Molinism, and
Yeah, I forgot about that
Arminianism.
one.
We did an episode where we talked about some of that, and a lot of that stuff's going to overlap with what we're talking about here. Where the way I approached it was, I just went through all of the major, I won't say all of, but I went through a lot of the major, really obvious passages of Scripture, Old and New Testament, that affirm the freedom of human, the ability to choose. Right? We went through all that, and everybody in my group was like, "Yeah, it's great, freedom, yeah." And then I went through and read all of these passages that were very, very strong on the sovereignty of God. So strong where it says things like, in this city, Pontius and Pilate and Herod did everything that your hand willed for them to do, right, in the book of Acts concerning the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, how do we square that circle, right? We're talking about people's actions being under the hand of God and doing exactly what God wants them to do. And also the actions we're talking about specifically are the most sinful actions ever in history, right? And we went through, and I went through every example I could think of that were like this, and I could see people squirming in their chairs by the end of it, right? And it was uncomfortable because for two reasons, I think. One is that it seemed like, at least on the surface, that it was at odds with all the other passages that I'd read about freedom, right? And then the other thing was that it felt uncomfortable because it seemed so foreign to the God that they know. It seemed more like those Greco-Roman gods who are pulling the strings.
Right.
And so you could see people just being like, oh, I don't, it's unfamiliar to me. And yet I was reading it from the scriptures, right? And so, and actually, this was probably cruel on my part, but like if you're watching and you're in my small group, I'm sorry. But like I just ended the group meeting and we didn't resolve it. I just let him go home. And I did it on purpose.
They didn't sleep that night.
Yeah, I did it on purpose because I wanted people to sit with
Yeah.
this tension, right? Sit with it for a while. And then when they come back, then we talked about, well, here are some ways that we can reconcile and make sense of this. Of course, one of the ways that I offered was this whole idea of Molinism, but it doesn't even have to be that. The idea is that the answer to how both of these things can be true, and where God gives humanity freedom because he wants to cooperate with them, and yet the result is not chaos, and the result is not that we are God, but that through the freedom that we have been given, God providentially orders things.
Yeah.
And he does so not by pulling strings, but by his knowledge.
He's
right?
playing 5D chess.
That's exactly right. It's because
5D chess.
this is one reason why this is so awe-inspiring, is the word you used
Yeah,
earlier, is
yeah.
because to me, what the answer to the question is, how could he do this, is baked into our conception of who God is, which is that he is the only wise God.
Yes.
Right? He is the only God who has the infinite knowledge and wisdom and understanding of persons, of events, of his entire creation, of himself and his own will, that he is able to arrange things, providentially arrange things without pulling the strings.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why he's a God who's worthy of worship, right? Which is that this forces me to do a couple things as a believer. It forces me to have the hyper awareness that you've been talking about, where it's like everything I do is important, right? The actions that I take, even the seemingly insignificant actions, are part of this symphony that God is conducting, right? And so it's all important. And yet, when I fail, to recognize the grace of God, that the grace of God is part of the symphony.
Yeah.
Right? So when I approach a passage in Scripture where there have been mistakes made, even beyond mistakes, willful acts of sin,
Right.
like the hands of Pontius Pilate and Herod, or perhaps the brothers of Joseph, who then Joseph is able to turn and say, what you intended for evil, God intended for good.
Yeah.
Right?
Joseph in the Old Testament.
Joseph in the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
He says this to his brother. He says, you intended this for evil. He acknowledges their freedom. You had intention when you did this, right? But God also had intention for it.
Yeah.
And is able, and this is the beautiful both and, because it forces me to recognize the responsibility that I have in my actions, but it also allows for that grace and the ability to trust. Maybe that's the key word, to trust in God and his providence.
Yeah. And we see this all throughout Scripture, which is also humbling. The fact that, we can read about men like Abraham and David and see just great men that were screw ups. I mean, truly.
They were.
But yet they're glorified in a sense because of the way that God's glorified through them.
That's right. Yeah.
And we read about them. I say that's what I mean by glorified. Because of really His providence throughout their
Yes.
lives, and
Yeah.
He, even though they were screw ups, He was still able to do what needed to be done.
Yeah.
That ultimately led us to Jesus, and then even after that.
Yeah, and I think that the plan of redemption as played out in the Gospels, um, this is why whenever the issue of the problem of evil and suffering comes up,
Mm,
you know, if you're not familiar, the problem of evil and suffering is, which I'm sure we'll do an episode on eventually,
I would like to, yeah.
is this question of like, how can we make sense of the idea of an all good, all powerful God and the idea that people suffer and there is evil in the world, right? How do those two things make sense? And there are, and in the whatever episode we do that, we talk about that. We can talk about some of the intellectual arguments for how those two things can coincide, and it makes perfect sense. But on a human experiential level, I always point people toward the cross,
Mm,
because the story of redemption, of what Jesus does in his incarnation, death, and resurrection, is that he shows us how human suffering that is wrong, that is not the way that things ought to be. Remember, he is tried and convicted unlawfully and as an innocent man.
Mm-hmm.
And the suffering that he endures is the means by which God brings redemption and salvation.
Yeah.
Right. And that's obviously the greatest story ever told, but it is also should be a macrocosm, sort of our microcosm, when we look at our own lives and we see that our suffering and hardship and the evil that we encounter in the world and in ourselves are not a indictment or a claim against God and His presence, but rather through these things, God will be glorified.
Yeah.
And the question of, well, how in my I see how it happened with Jesus. He was resurrected and blah, blah, blah. How in my circumstances this suffering going to bring God glory, and is it going to benefit me, work together for my good, right? And the answer is, back to the thing we were talking about earlier when we were talking about judgment, and it applies here as well, which is that we're not in a position now to be presumptive to think that we could know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And again, a future episode we could do would be on the book of Job, which is a perfect example of this.
And I think too, there are more comparisons to be drawn here, with like art, for example. Just to completely reframe this, maybe in a way that for some of our listeners, maybe, I don't know, maybe it'll be helpful. But a lot of times we look at particular instances of evil in our lives as if we're like, really, really zoomed in on a particular painting. I don't know if you've ever like looked at a painting before, like close up, but like you can get close enough to a painting to where what you see is like unappealing, and it seems, if that was all you knew of that painting, it would seem pointless. It's like, why do people think this is beautiful? But then you take a step out and maybe you see like a figure, right? Or something in that. But even then, a figure, like especially if you're talking about modern art, sometimes the figures can be kind of ugly and unappealing, right? So you have more perspective, but it still looks bad.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you mean this is good? What do you mean this is something that's beautiful or something that I should celebrate, or it could be the product of a good artist? But, eventually, and I think by grace, you get more and more perspective. And ultimately, at the ultimate level, I think it is, a gift from God that allows you to accept the fact that even though there are parts of this great work that you can't see, it is beautiful and it is fitting together well. And these sorts of visionary moments, I think that God gives us sometimes, that a sense of peace that, yes, it all fits together. And sometimes He'll give us insights as to, oh yeah, like that bad thing, well, here's how it fits into the good plan.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's one way of looking at it. And in our modern world, one of the reasons why this might sound like cope or like, just silliness or like, oh, Pollyannish, is because our modern world, there's been a crisis in believing that there is a big picture that fits together. And you can see this in the history of art.
Yes.
And but even so, and I've studied a lot of 20th century art and up to like postmodern art even so, even when we don't believe that there is an overarching big picture, we still put things together in such a way that asks the question, what is the bigger picture, right? And so I think that there is this fundamental human yearning for a glimpse at the big picture, even if we don't believe in it. But as Christians, of course, we do believe in the big picture.
Yeah.
And it can be very, very hard to keep that kind of perspective because we are limited creatures. But I think that there are moments, and speaking personally, I can say there have been some moments in my life where God will kind of give you an assurance of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said for what you just said there, but of course, I'm sure what the listeners and viewers are thinking are of the times where God doesn't give you that glimpse.
Yeah.
Right. Which these are the instances wherein we are called upon, because there's nothing else left. We are called upon to trust God.
Yeah.
Right. And when we are called upon to trust God, the only thing we have to fall back on is, well, who is it that I'm trusting?
Yeah.
Right. And do I have good reason to trust him? And of course, I think if you look at who God is, both in Scripture and in your own life, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. He is a God who is worth trusting, even when I don't have the perspective, even when I'm too close to the painting to see what the order is, to see that there is any meaning here, right?
Yeah.
And this is, I mentioned Job. This, I think, really is what the primary thrust of that book, how it ends, is God showing the difference in perspective, his perspective versus Job's, and leaving open this thing hanging in the air, which is to say, do you trust me? Right. And I think, you mentioned art, that you can see this in a lot of 20th century art. This might sound like a sidebar, but it is connected. But it's there. If you go look at my shelves in my personal library and look in the fiction section, you will notice some very notable names who are missing. And if you're just aware of like who the popular fictional authors are of the 20th century, you would be like, hey, where are these people? And I'm thinking of people like Hemingway, right? I'm thinking of you won't find The Great Gatsby on my shelf, and things like this. And some people might look at that and go, well, why is that? Well, the reason why is because there was a trait among certain authors that are sometimes called the lost generation, right? Which are people in the post-World War I era who had become so disillusioned with society and disillusioned with a structure and with authority and so forth that they stopped believing that there was any meaning to anything. And that's reflected in their work. It's very often seems like an aimless series of events that take place in these, and some of them are very dark and they offer no vision of hope. I'm not opposed to dark books. I read Dostoevsky all the time, but it's a very different approach. And the reason why is because these people have determined in their mind that there is no perspective that could reveal the beauty in this or the order in this. And I think sometimes that people, even in present day, will fall into the same trap that the lost generation did, which is that exposure to overwhelming suffering, like the First World War in their case, is in a sense a way in which we are drawn in closer to the picture, where we can't see. And because of that, we make the wrong inference that says, because I can't see it, it's not there. Yeah. And that's a thing that I think we have to check ourselves on.
But as a formalist, as someone who looks at the form that works are made with, this was kind of what I studied when I was in graduate school and writing and doing research about this, is that I look at those books and I totally, I don't like many of those myself, but I look at those books and I say, well, isn't it still interesting that these people had a nihilistic view of the world, or
Yeah.
one that said nothing coheres, there's no meaning here, but they wrote about it. They put it in a book.
Yeah.
Right? We can say meaningful and interesting things about those books.
Yeah.
They cohere as works of art, even if we disagree with the content.
Right.
And for me, that fact alone, that these are still things that we can view and discuss and analyze and appreciate some of the different artistic choices
Yeah.
that they made. That fact alone points to the fact that no, the message contained in here is probably off base.
Yeah.
Because despite their best efforts and their their most pervasive nihilism, there is something of meaning.
Yeah,
you know,
there are
to get out of this.
classrooms of people sitting around who have read The Sun Also Rises or The Old Man in the Sea, and they say, "What did Hemingway mean?"
Yeah.
Even though he's told us he didn't mean anything.
Yeah, he
People
said
still
it,
ask the question.
but it is so ingrained in us to expect there to be meaning that we still discuss what is the meaning of meaninglessness. And
Yeah, exactly.
and it can be absurd, but I think it's also, if you zoom out, it is also immensely encouraging.
And part of that is that we know innately, because we are created in God's image, we know innately that there is a story that's being told, a cosmic story and a story within our own lives. And so, you'll hear secular people say, like, we're meaning making people, or we search for meaning. And I would say C.S. Lewis made the argument that if you have a desire for something, a hunger or a thirst for something, it implies the existence of that thing.
Mm.
Right? People don't thirst, and there is no such thing as water.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that we search for this meaning, I think, points us in the direction that we know that God is unfolding a narrative that includes us.
Yeah. This unraveled differently than I anticipated, but in the best way.
Good.
So I'm glad I asked my question, but it does open up a lot more questions that I think people are asking, that we can address in future episodes. I mean, I'm just thinking of like prayer and why do we pray?
Yeah.
Our intended topic today, but on miracles and other spiritual gifts, and are they still happening? How and why? There was something else that came to my mind too. I just think there's a lot deeper that we can go, but we've already been going for a while. So, yeah. Any final thoughts on anything before we wrap this thing
No,
up?
just that we should do some of these sort of like impromptu Courtney asks a question episodes moving forward, because I like that. It was fun.
That was a great question,
Yeah.
and I feel like there's tons more to potentially say, but I don't there's so many. Oh,
I don't even know if we answered the question.
Great question.
No, it was great. But I'm sure there's people that are watching or listening that have questions like this. My question came from just reading the Iliad.
Mhm.
So, I am reading the Odyssey now. Super excited,
Awesome.
pumped for that movie to come out. But yeah, if you're just going about life and have questions that pop up, send us a message, make a comment on some of our posts, and maybe we'll talk about it here, just like we did today. So thanks for following along, and we'll see you next time.